All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. We're foregoing intro music today. Feel free to hop on your camera, let there be light in the Stoa. We have an intimate group here today. Might have more people join us later on. But this is the first official session for Sebastian Marshall's Philosopher-in-Residence series at the Stoa. Called Industrial Philosophy, Applying the Scientist Mindset and Skill Set for Wisdom and Practicality. Sebastian is doing some amazing work over at Ultra Working. And the title of his business kind of gives away what it's about. It's about developing high productive and efficient workers and individuals. And I definitely recommend some of his products that he launches. One of them, Pentathlon, which is quite good. I took it the last iteration. I got a lot out of it. And so I invited Sebastian because he has some of the best tools and techniques and framings on how to get stuff done in the real world, but still ask deep questions. And so he provided this idea of industrial philosophy. And I'll just tag in Sebastian and set some framing. We'll be here for maybe about 60 minutes, and it's going to be a highly interactive session. So, my friend, welcome back to the Stoa and Happy New Year.
Thank you, Peter. And I hope we didn't scare people off with we're going to do some statistics and scientific literacy and things of that nature. I think this is going to be incredibly practical, but also with a very interesting theoretical grounding, right? So the goal here is to get better at thinking and taking action in the world, right? And one of my beliefs, and this is like the core idea behind what we're doing, and then why I'm very grateful Peter invited me to participate here in January, is I'm very strongly of the belief, like we talked about in session 0, right? That one of the reasons philosophy maybe doesn't have as much output and power, mainstream philosophy, as it did in ancient years. Do you know what I mean? There's some good work happening right now, but when you read about what was going on with Aristotle and Xenophon and Plato and Socrates and a little bit off to the side, people are inventing geometry and figuring out all this stuff. Maybe there's not that same level of energy and engagement and excitement around philosophy. And why is that? One of my ideas that, after thinking about it a lot, is I think that when science got broken out of philosophy, because from like time immemorial, from like 3,000-ish years ago up until mid to late 1800s, science was called natural philosophy. Science is a relatively new word, right? And so you wouldn't just be an ethicist, or somebody investigating metaphysics or language, right? That table, where they sat down to eat or drink together, there would be a physicist there. There'd be a marine biologist there. And they didn't have the terms physicist or marine biologist, but one person would be like, hey, I'm investigating like how the laws and courts work in this other society. And someone's like, cool, I'm tramping around this island looking at how like turtles like lay eggs and give birth to their young. And like, how are we figuring this all out? And that grounding in like, you could make a theory of turtles that like new turtles spontaneously occur, or that turtles are born live like humans, or turtles are born from eggs. And like one of these is right and the other one is wrong, right? And that type of rigor and grounding really, really helped even on the more abstract ideas. What's a great life? How does a city get governed well? How do people work together, right? You can talk very abstractly of like, how do we be kind to each other? And like, that's a very hard question to answer. Kindness is different things to different people. If, a parent is very firm with their kids when one of their kids is kind of being a little bit foolish in an area, is that kind or unkind? And how do you deal with that, right? But, if you have something where you're actually trying to do something, you're trying to get some outcome, you're trying to win a sporting contest, you're trying to figure out what the turtles are doing, you win or lose a sporting contest and you figure out correctly or not the turtle thing, right? And what winds up happening is you learn that you can be dead sure of something and then be mistaken, right? So I think that there's a lot of value in the ability to actually be wrong. Modern science isn't all falsifiability, but it's a big part of it. And I think that filtered back into philosophical thinking when natural philosophy, science, was literally under the umbrella of philosophy, and if they'd organized a university along modern lines back in the way ancient world, then the people working on ethics and the people working on biology would have been in the same department, right? As opposed to in different departments and on different majors. We've literally broken out where there's Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Science, and they maybe don't interact as much as they would have in the ancient world, right? So a few things for us today. Here's the objectives, right? So first, I want to give you an argument to think about and evaluate on your own time, right? That in the past, you were forced to stay in a condition of uncertainty longer than today. If you wanted to look into something, there were benefits to that. Much of that, the necessity of that has gone away with like Google and being able to get answers really quickly. I think there's harmful side effects of that, but I think it can be deliberately cultivated. But then if you agree with that, right? I think a lot of people have like a classification in their head of like, I know this thing or I don't know it. Like it's either like I know what's going on here or I don't. Whereas I think you can actually see that by degree, incrementally. You can be like, I think this might be the right answer, right? But then how do you test that and check that and get into that more? And then there's some tools around thinking. This is where math, scientific literacy, statistics can be helpful. We're going to do a pretty grounded version of this. It's not going to be too intense. It's not going to be the actual calculating part of math is like middle school level. It's very comfortable. It's just a way to think about the world, right? And later when we get into future sessions, we'll talk about how that can filter back into day-to-day decision-making and evaluating more abstract ideas. I think it can. That's the more speculative part that we'll get to towards the end of these sessions, but today's going to be hyper practical. So here's what we're going to do today. I will do a little screen share. I will share this with you momentarily. If you have a Notion account, you can copy it and interact with it. If you do not, that's also totally fine, and I can you can work with that accordingly. So we're gonna look at three things today, right? What we'll do when we break off into a little bit of personal study time is we'll go through this together, and then we can also talk about it. This is a wonderful piece. I think this is like the best. You're already a little bit knowledgeable about how science works. Like I wouldn't give this to like a 14-year-old that's just starting to learn the ropes. But if you just got basic exposure to the sciences, I think this is the best way to just quickly double check and level up really quickly. Was a scientific study good or not? It's like quite funny, it's quite good, and there's like cases in here. And so we could go through and we can evaluate, hey, which of these did we already know and which did we not know in advance? It's relatively short. So we could do this in real time together. And then I built a little checklist here that you could go through and say, which of these did I already know or not know? And you could check them off, and whichever ones you check off as having known, that's cool. Whichever ones that you didn't know in advance, this is my favorite one. Confusing the probability of H given E with the probability of E given H. If you don't immediately know what that means when we go look at this together, when you take a read of it, then that's something that if you learn this, it will make your life a lot better, right? I'll talk about that one just for a second before we go on and make it a little less abstract, right? There's a class of error that you'll see in newspapers and popular science all the time that I think gets people, right? And the argument, like you'll see something like, red wine prevents you from getting dementia, or like chocolate cures cancer type arguments, right? And like, for me, the way I make fun of this is I say like, hey, like riding in a BMW cures cancer. Hey, we did a correlational study, and people that drive a BMW as opposed to another car have double the survival rate of people that don't drive a BMW. BMWs cure cancer. And like they're missing a really, really obvious thing, which is that people that drive BMWs tend to be wealthier. They tend to have access to better food, better medicine, and so on and so forth. They tend to have resources and be established and so on and so forth, right? So you'll see it all the time in media, and sometimes even from scientists that really ought to know better, but sometimes get this wrong, that they'll do a correlational study and they'll screw up the causation, right? So they'll see that like, hey, like upper class people eat fine dark chocolate. Upper class people are healthier and then we'll screw up and say fine dark chocolate makes you healthier. I mean, it might not, right? But you would have to, do actually a controlled thing where like you take some people that weren't going to eat chocolate either way, you give half of them chocolate, you track it over time and so on and so forth, right? So we'll read this together. This is a bunch of things that you can look at. You're not going to need to develop all of these techniques yourself, but you should be at least familiar with them, right? What is a randomized controlled trial? We probably hear that phrase a lot if we care about science stuff. What is a double-blind study? This right here, statistical significance, right? What is statistical significance, right? Statistical significance, if you flip a coin and it comes up heads once, somebody could say, let's say flip a coin and it comes up heads 3 times, and somebody says, hey, that thing will always come up heads when we flip it, right? That would be dumb, right? A coin can come up heads 3 times in a row, right? 12.5% chance of that happening, 50% times 50% times 50%, right? That's obviously kind of stupid. We wouldn't make that mistake with a coin. We know a coin can come up. You'd have to flip the coin 100 times, 200 times, 1,000 times to know whether it's a 50-50 coin or not, right? But people make this mistake in stock market. They make this mistake in real estate. They make this mistake when they meet somebody and that person seems to do good work like once. Do you know what I mean? Sure. Seeing somebody does good work once is predictive, but and so on and so forth. So we'll go through this together and we'll assess what we already know or don't know out of this. And whatever you don't know are tools that you could learn and develop if you wanted. Probably any one of these you could get a basic understanding of if you don't already have it in probably 2 to 4 hours. And you could probably have like a pretty sophisticated understanding of the topic in 20 hours if you want. And like, yeah, I mean, like, I think it's as valuable as like watching a season of Breaking Bad to like add a new technique that whenever you see a news piece, or whenever you have an idea at work, you could be like, ah, cool. Did they do this? Did they do this? Did they do this? Right. So it's kind of like, this is like a master's degree in like general science in like, I don't know, 50 hours if you need to run all the topics down, but you probably know a lot of them already. Right. And then we're going to look at calibration in predictions. If we can get a chat, or feel free to flip your camera on and give a thumbs up or not. Who here's come across like statistical calibration prediction stuff before? I'll pull it back up in a second. Give me a chat. Like, have you come across this? Like how people make predictions? Maybe you were involved in either theoretically or hands-on. You did some gambling. Maybe you did sports betting or horse racing or anything like that. Calibration, statistics stuff. Okay. Anybody? All right, cool. This should be a ton of fun then. We will do this second, right? But we'll give a little preview of it right now, right? A lot of the world is just super, super, super messy. And this wonderful guy named Phil Tetlock, who's at Wharton, worked on a super large scale statistics project for a long period of time, where he would get people together and he would ask them extremely like clear questions, like, will the exchange rate of the euro to the US dollar be above $1.10 to 1 euro? Will it be above that on October 1st, 2019? He would ask them, right? And they would say yes or no, is my guess. And then he would ask them, how sure are you of that? Right? So confidence in statistics can never be below 50%. In an idea, if you're below 50%, you don't think it's true. So like the way we talk about confidence in statistics is like, how likely are you that that's true, right? And on a binary proposition, it's no more than 50. Otherwise, you'd take the other side and it'd be 50 or more, right? So 50%, if it's like a yes-no thing, 50% would be, yeah, I have no clue. I'm just guessing. I don't know anything about the dollar. I don't know anything about the euro. Like if it's already 110 right now, I don't know if it's going to go up or down, 50%. If you're 99% sure, you're dead certain that it's going to be right. And what he talks about here is a lot of people use vague words, right? The Greek default may be a matter of days away. And then he goes on, he says like, look, may is like if it doesn't happen, you're not wrong. I said it may happen, right? And he says what we want to do, right, is we want to say, hey, we think there's a 70% chance of rain tomorrow if you're calling the weather. And if the weather happens often enough, which it does, over time, you want to be correctly calibrated. So if you say that it's 60% to rain, right, you don't actually want it to rain 100% of the time to be correct. You want it to be 60%, right? and you can be under or over confident, right? So you could say, yeah, it's going to rain, it's going to rain, it's going to rain, right? If you're in Portland, Oregon, where it rains a lot, right? And you say it's going to rain today, you're actually going to be right 90% of the time, but you're going to be miscalibrated. You're going to over predict rain, right? On the other hand, if you're like, it might rain, it's like, it's like 60, 70% to rain, but it rains 90, then you're also wrong. So we can, or you're miscalibrated rather, right? So we can learn this sort of stuff. It really doesn't take that long, and I hope people aren't intimidated by it, right? But these are the type of tools that I think you can add and you can prove out in a science context, in a business context, in a, how do we do this thing, in the real world? If you're doing a charity fundraising drive, like how do we get enough dollars in here that we can do the charitable thing that we want to do, right? And you can kind of make some predictions and develop them over time. I also believe that doing this will make you better at reasoning about hey, how do I want to live? Would I be happy if I live this way? Would I be effective if I live this way? Is this a good way to communicate or live together as a family or as a company or as a team, right? And then the final thing that we'll do today is we can have a bit of an open discussion on how to make this work with large, complex, messy things in real life. Because a lot of times, real life's really messy, right? Do you know what I mean? Is your office set up well for work? If you're working from home or if you got an office, how should that be laid out? How should that be set up? How could we even do anything like making predictions or doing some little lightweight statistics around that? There actually are ways to reduce that to things you can work with, right? So you could do, for instance, things like a proxy variable, right? In management, we'll talk about this. In management science, right? They found it's very, very, very hard to track morale. Everybody agrees that morale is a thing. There are teams that are bought in and doing a great job together, and there are teams that are not. But they found it's very, very hard to figure out, what morale is. But people calling in sick to work actually super correlates with morale in large enough teams, right? On teams where you're doing the Apollo mission, you know what I mean? You're trying to land people on the moon. Everyone's really wants to be at work. Yeah, you're feeling a little run down, or maybe somebody went out drinking on a Wednesday night and on Thursday they wake up with a big hangover or whatever. They don't call in sick. They show up. People take sick days when they're sick, but on teams where people are not happy, they call in sick a lot more. And so they found among high morale places, less sick days, low morale places, more sick days. It just correlated a lot. So sometimes you could study a proxy variable. It's not the thing you want, but it correlates a lot. So we can look for things like that. And there's other techniques to take what we're doing in our life, and then how do we see whether it's working or not. All right. So allow me to share. If you have a Notion account, who here? Notion? People have Notion? No? Yes? Okay. If you have Notion, you can copy this to your own Notion if you like. If you do not have Notion, that's totally fine. What we're going to do is we're going to spend a little bit of time reading this together. You could fast read it, and then maybe you can copy paste this out of chat. There you go. Absolutely, you can. And so what we're going to do is we're going to just assess. Hey, that's a breakdown of everything. He didn't list them the same exact way that I did. I kind of broke them out. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend some time reading this together. And then we're going to say, hey, which of these did you already know in advance? And then we're going to talk about it a little bit. It's totally okay to not know them, right? So had you come across and knew the concept of publication bias, before you saw this piece? I think this is an incredible piece. This is generally how I start when I want to take somebody that's again, I wouldn't do this with someone that's 13, 14. It's just learning about what science is, but someone's kind of around science, maybe looked at a research paper or two in their life, or they're interested in the stuff in the media, hey, how to be healthy? What's a healthy diet? And things like that. You're kind of interested in that. I think this is the fastest sword sharpening piece of its type. So let's go ahead and pull this up. And let's spend 10 minutes. Let's spend 10 minutes each reading individually and scoring it, and then we can talk about it at the end of it. I'll give you a warning when there's 2 minutes left. So does everybody get this? We're going to pull up Norvig, experimentdesign.html. The link is in chat. You're going to have 10 minutes to read. Then we're going to rank ourselves. Hey, which of these did we already know in advance and we're comfortable with conceptually? Then we could talk about that a little bit, because these are all concepts or tools that you can use to evaluate, are these good ideas or not good ideas. So we're spending 10 minutes on that together. Does that work for everybody? Got it?
Sebastian, what are we reading? What are we reading?
I will put the link in the chat one more time.
Are we reading the list? Simply the list?
There's a URL right there in chat, norvig.com/experimentdesign.html.
Thank you.
And then my list is a little checklist to evaluate afterwards, whether the concepts made sense or not, right? So his isn't a checklist piece. He wrote an essay. He wrote an essay where he's like, it's funny, by the way, there's like a lot of like, I hate this stupid error in the world thing. It wasn't, a text for academic things. It was an essay, but it's pretty rigorous. So we got a little checklist at the end. Just have a read first, and then afterwards we can rate, hey, which of these did we know or not know before we started? Use that as a jumping off point that maybe could replace some Breaking Bad time, which I suppose actually has some decent chemistry in it, but we could replace it with actually learning some of how to evaluate chemistry. It's really not that hard. It's all pretty accessible. So let's spend 10 minutes with that. I'll keep a timer. I'll let you know when there's 2 minutes left. I don't have to go through the whole thing. Yeah, let's go from there. All right, let's go 2 more minutes here. I will ask everyone via either chat or unmute what their most interesting line was from the piece when we get into it. So we'll do that in about 2 minutes. All right, cool. What's everybody's favorite or most interesting or most illuminating thing out of there? You could either unmute or copy paste into chat. I'll share mine to kick it out. Right? Mine is this thing here, which was like a little bit of an epiphany for me. This was in the confusing the probability of H given E with E given H. Let's say you get a test for CNSV and the test is correct 99% of the time. And Sam had that and said they have CNSV, which is a very rare medical condition. And somebody else, right, had Pat had a test for a cold, which is right 99% of the time. You're probably, going to say, hey, it's 99% for both of them, right? But actually, in Sam's case, it's 0.01 because the base rate of that is so low, and Pat's is only 92%. That's like mind-blowing, and it's like absolutely correct. All right, let's take a look at everybody else's. Danny has, there are many possible sources of bias errors, for instance, D4, but they can't be neatly quantified with a numeric score, so there is a tendency to ignore them. Yeah, and this is why I think this is so cool, right? Is so I don't know, probably people here of different ages, right? I was born in 1985, so I was going to school as a kid in the 1990s primarily. And in the United States, we had something called drug abuse resistance education, DARE. And there was these big shirts that said DARE. And later, DARE got abandoned when they found, I actually did some statistics, and I might have this wrong. I heard this, I didn't triple check it. So if I'm giving you false information here, you can sharing an anecdote that might be apocryphal. I don't know, maybe it's not true, but I think they found that exposing kids to all of this information about drugs actually increased drug use. Because I remember we had a police officer come in with like a big bale of like seized marijuana and like plastic evidence wrap, and like, here's some psilocybin mushrooms and here's some acid tabs, and this is the size of them, and this stuff will kill you kids, don't do it. And we got like an education in like what drugs are and what they look like and the street prices of them and stuff like that. And later people were like, wait a second, maybe this isn't very effective. But in DARE, they had this concept of a gateway drug, right? Like the argument, the primary argument, and I don't do any recreational drugs for the record, but I think it's a useful metaphor. The primary argument against marijuana, which is, if you look at any of the toxicity or addictiveness levels or the chemical withdrawal profiles on it, it's from a pharmacological standpoint, probably safer than alcohol. I think that's reasonable to say. And like people drink and nobody's really too worked up about it, right? But the argument is that, hey, only deviants, this is the 90s, remember, only deviants do marijuana. And if you're at a place doing marijuana, it's a gateway drug. Pretty soon you'll be doing some lines of cocaine, and then you'll be injecting heroin under the bridge, and your life will be ruined. This is the gateway drug argument, right? Well, I think we could use this as a bit of a metaphor and say that, like, look, getting into the hard science stuff, right? This stuff about if there's a rare medical condition that you test positive for, you probably don't have it because the base rate is low. And if there's a very, very common one you test positive for, and both the tests are 99% accurate, like that has to filter in, right? That's like correct, even though it's like difficult to get your mind around a little bit. Like you got to study it a little bit. It's not like, right? You get your mind around that. Then like a couple of steps away from that is like, okay, if we poll the wrong people, who are you going to vote for in the election? And we only get a subset of people that are like the wrong people, like that aren't a representation of the American electorate, then we're going to get the wrong result. How do you poll people accurately? How do you get a group of the right people? You know, if we only poll people that watch The Sopranos or watch the National Football League or watch like The Joy of French Cooking on TV, if we only poll those people, like they're not predictive of everybody's beliefs. Okay, it's a little bit softer, it's a little more qualitative. And then you get into very qualitative ideas, which we'll do later. How do you evaluate those? So yeah, I think that's absolutely correct, Danny. And my hope is that some of this stuff is a bit of a gateway drug, metaphorically speaking, into like, okay, hey, we could do like science and math here. Like this is like the right way to do it, right? And then here it's like, it's the same principles, but it's a little bit more work. And then like out here, it's like we've lost the ability to do that, but hopefully we've become better thinkers. And then we can apply like good thinking to it. All right, cool. Kevin said he was reading this in Richard Feynman's voice. Yeah, you know, I was thinking about this the other day. To engage with that a little bit. I was thinking about this the other day. And I was thinking about, you know, if you tried to take somebody with a set of like a broad, like what's important in life, like what's your moral orientation, your political orientation, your social orientation, and you like bring them back in time to another era, even people that like you would see as sympathetic within the same movement would like not get along very well, right? You know, you take somebody that's a very traditionalist or very progressive from 2023 and you bring them back to 1923 or 1823, they'd be like, whoa, this is bizarre. They wouldn't like each other. With maybe one exception, which are like people that are really into causality and trying to understand how things work in science, right? Like I think you take Richard Feynman, you put him in a room with Aristotle, and I think they'd get along just fine. You know, I think they would get along just fine. Whereas, you know, you take Thomas Paine from the American Revolution, you take some, you know, somebody that you would think is kind of an equivalent thinker from the same branch of thought, and you put him in the same room with Thomas Paine, like, hey, what do you think is true? What I think is true? What's a good life? Whatever. They probably wouldn't get along. Do you know what I mean? But I think you could take anybody that was into science and good epistemology from today, send them back into the past, find those other people, and I think they would get along just fine. You know, I think you take Euclid, you know, put them in the same room with Feynman or Erdős, and I think they would get along great. And I think Euclid would be like, wow, this is so cool. Look at what you've done with all the math stuff and geometry stuff and whatever. So very, very cool. Stevenson, lack of theory. Didn't know about Einstein. Yeah, that's really interesting. Whether you like his general orientations towards life or not, Peter Thiel's got some really, really good thinking on how like the world's become kind of like anti-theory. The world's become like anti-theory in some ways of like, hey, we should just trial and error, move fast and break things on everything because we can't predict or control the future. Then he has like a long thing that he talks about in his book, 0 to 1, about how like it used to be that we were like, hey, we're going to like take Chicago and rise it above the water levels. We're going to build like levees in New Orleans and hold back the water. We're going to like land people on the moon. And people would set these like big, very definitive visions and like work towards them. Right. And now people are like, I don't know, maybe the levees destroy the environment around there. I don't know. We should go really slow. We should do it incrementally and then see what happens. Like we shouldn't have a theory. Right. And he talks about how people used to get into professions where they're like, I want to do this and solve this problem in the world. And then now people go into stuff like consulting, which is like consulting is like the most unspecialized field, like general management consulting. It's unspecialized. Like, hey, I'm like good at solving problems, but there's no particular problem I want to solve. Right. So yeah, theory is interesting. And then likewise, in the absence of a theory, if you're looking for stuff that just sounds plausible, you can just like look at a data set, look for something that's anomalous and make a story out of it. And it's okay. It's absolutely okay to see a data set, say, this is interesting, make a theory out of that, and then do it again. Do you know what I mean? That's where a lot of good ideas come from. But just like, look at this crazy result, let's pull it out. You know, could be an outlier. The 99.85% of radio towers don't cause cancer, if anybody saw that in there. Right? You know, there's these cancer clusters around these towers. It's like, well, again, you have a random statistical distribution and there's, you know, some other factors or whatever. Some places, you know what I mean? If the odds of any given person contracting a certain illness is some amount, just randomly, people in certain buildings will have a lot more of it than others. Right? And then it's like, it's that building. And it's like, maybe, you know, we could look into it, but maybe not. All right, Chris has warning sign 5, the wrong questions. Or you treat different plots of crops with different fertilizers and believe that the fertilizer used in plot number 4 is more effective when actually the wind and water seepage has pushed the fertilizer south by 1 plot. And really it's the number 3 one that's most effective. Yeah, reality is complex, isn't it? It's kind of challenging, right? It's hard to get your mind around, right? So I believe, and this is one of the core ideas from today, right? I believe that if you really like actually just sit and think about what happened and how people learned, you had to be comfortable with uncertainty for longer when you looked into things, right? So I barely remember the era before the internet really went off and was a thing, right? And I remember the local library. So I also remember like pre-cell phones, right? Where like I just tell my friend like, hey, I'll meet you, you know, in front of the convenience store at 3 p.m. Bring your skateboard. And like they just like didn't show up. I could like get the payphone and like call their house and ask if they know, if their parents know where they are. If they just don't show up, well, I'm just screwed and I'll just go home. Do you know what I mean? Right? As opposed to the ability to go like text, hey, where are you? I'm on the way, whatever. Right? Well, you think about scholars before the internet, you might like be very interested in, you know, how does ATP, right? Adenosine triphosphates used in energy in the Krebs cycle, right? You might be like really interested, like, hey, does that like operate slightly differently in elite athletes, right? Like, does their ATP cycle work differently? And you would have to like call around to different libraries and university libraries and say, can I get an interlibrary loan of a book or the study on that? And then you'd have to wait like 2 or 3 weeks to be able to actually read it. Right? So you'd have this idea that like, hey, maybe ATP is different, maybe like the processing and like how it works and whatever is different in elite athletes. And like you'd like have to think about it or just have this as an open question for like 3 weeks until you got somebody else to study, and the study might not even answer the question. Whereas right now we got Google, we can basically find just about any research paper in history, you know, and go read it. Basically all of the books that have like ever been made, all the out of copyright ones are on Google Books, and just about everything in copyright's on Amazon. Right? And now there's Kindle versions. You don't even have to wait 2 days to get the super fast shipping to show up. You can go buy it and read it in 5 minutes, right? So I think back then you would like form an idea and it would take you 3 weeks to get more data on it from somebody else that had written about it or talked about it or thought about it. So you'd be in this like uncertainty condition for 2 or 3 weeks where you would develop your ideas and you'd be like, I don't know, maybe it's this way, maybe it's that way. I'm interested in reading this paper. Now we can Google ATP and elite athletes, you know, right? Click some stuff and like you can probably get your answer within like half an hour. So I think we spend less time in this condition of uncertainty. And I think there's a lot of value in staying in that condition of uncertainty and getting comfortable with it. And I think uncertainty can absolutely be a virtue at various times. All right. So let's get into a little bit of statistics. I already did a little bit of this in the overview, right? I already did a little bit of this in the overview. This is a book, Super Forecasting, the Art and Science of Prediction. I will very enthusiastically recommend half of this book. Unfortunately, the other half of it is shipped along with it as a complete whole. So you have to read the half I don't like in order to read the half I do like, right? So this is like some extremely good mathematical, really simple, not difficult ones, techniques around like prediction. How do we know it's true or false? And then there's like cute stories to make it accessible to the general public and like sell more copies that are kind of like, it's like, okay, like it's not so bad. Do you know what I mean? But like the good part I like a lot, right? So he says, hey, so this is about forecasting. This is about predicting that something is going to happen or not happen. Obviously, if you're in finance, this is very relevant. You know, you're investing in a bond. You don't think the bond is going to default, obviously, or you wouldn't invest in it, right? And you also think that, you know, that bond is either going to have a higher yield or more safety than some other investment, right? I think we're actually all implicitly making predictions all the time. If you're thinking of like, I don't really like my apartment, you know, sometimes the water pressure in the shower is not really good. There's not enough light in the kitchen and stuff. I should move. You're implicitly predicting that you're going to be either happier or healthier or more productive in a new place, right? You know, if you go to get a job, if you hire somebody, if you, even when you go to a restaurant and you order something, you choose a particular restaurant, you're implicitly making a prediction there that that's going to work out pretty good for you, right? But we don't tend to think of it that way, even though that's what we're doing, right? Most people make kind of like very vague, can fox their way out of it predictions, right? So, you know, mainstream mass politics is obviously always a dangerous topic and has been more fraught maybe the last 10 years. But, you know, people will say statements like, if so-and-so, my person gets elected, these things will happen, right? And it's like, well, okay, like how likely is that? Do you know what I mean? Like, and how would we evaluate that, right? Like the country will become safer or the country will become fairer, whatever, right? And it's like, okay, how do we define safety or how do we define fairness? And like, what are the odds on that? Because it's not 100, right? It's not 100. Like you might think safety is going to go great, but then whatever, there's a massive power blackout, you know, in one city for a week. And then there's some crime that happens when there's a blackout that is like nothing to do with whether your guy or gal is elected to office. It's, you know, things like that happens. If you're defining safety as like crimes happening, right? Like there's things outside of people's control, right? If safety is more generally like whatever, casualties or people like living longer, you know, something like a Hurricane Katrina, you know, or a Fukushima disaster in Japan can like hurt a lot of people that like probably isn't the current person in charge's fault. I mean, maybe, but probably not, right? So he says here, hey, if we want to get serious about stuff, we need to have clearly defined terms, timelines, numbers, and a lot of them, right? We just looked at Norvig's warning signs together, right? You need to have a lot of predictions and a lot of data to be able to know whether you're right or wrong about stuff. And again, a lot of people, when they're doing moral philosophy or political philosophy or practical philosophy, right? How do we live well? How do we get along with each other? What's true? What matters? Type stuff. They have ideas they hold very, very strongly to that are very, very abstract, that don't cash out in any predictions. So they can't be right or wrong. They can't be wrong, but they also can't be right. You know what I mean? Right? So this is a challenge because if you move between apartments, right? If you move between apartments, you don't know what would have happened if you stayed, or did you just get really unlucky with a particular apartment or whatever. But if you make predictions in general, hey, I think I'm like 80% more likely to like the new place, or like, you know, you move to a building that has a gym in the apartment building, right? And that's one of the reasons you're going to pay more for a new apartment. It's like the exact same apartment, but there's a gym in that building. How often do you predict you're going to go to the gym? I bet I go to the gym more than 10 times in the 1 year I lived there, more than 50 times, whatever. You can write that down. You do a couple little very easy checks as to whether you went or not. And then you can see, okay, am I going to actually use a new feature of an apartment building or something like that? And you can learn, right? So with any given thing, am I going to like a new apartment? You don't get to rerun history, you only get one. But you can have a lot of these happening. We're always making decisions. We're always having stuff happen in the world, right? So for perfect forecasting, you know, if you say 70% this will happen, then you want it to be 70, right? Or if it happens 70, you want to predict 70, right? That's perfectly calibrated. You can be under or overconfident. And it's also worth knowing when you're underconfident or when you're overconfident, right? I'm sure we all have friends that are like, oh, I knew this stock was going to go off. You know, I knew I should have invested in Tesla or cryptocurrency or whatever. And they won't shut up about it, but they didn't invest in it, right? It's like one of two things here, right? They might have like some selection bias, some memory problems, right? Where they remember their winners and not their losers. Humans tend to do that, right? but they might actually be right, but they're not confident enough, right? They might be underconfident, right? In their predictions, so they don't act on them. And it's worth figuring out which you are. It's very unlikely you're perfectly calibrated. And typically within both in all of life and within domains, you're probably under or overconfident, right? You're probably overconfident in your ideas. Like, I'm sure this is going to work. And then it's like 60%. Like, that's not bad to be 60, but 60 and you're dead sure is a little bit dangerous, right? You know what I mean? Right? Maybe you don't do enough risk mitigation. Maybe you don't do enough due diligence. Maybe you don't bring in enough other people to say, hey, can you look at this idea and make sure it's one of my 60% of good ideas and not the 40% of bad ideas that I have. And then the flip side, there's people with some great ideas that are underconfident, right? That are underconfident, so they don't act on them and they're way too cautious. There's some people that have a lot of good ideas that work really well, that when they finally get around to doing one of them, it works really well, but they're like really, really way too cautious. They might give themselves only a 5% or a 10% chance of success on a given thing when they might be at 50, 60, 70, 80. And I think over time you want to correct this, and over time you want to be able to calibrate, right? Like, I know roughly how many ideas I need to go through when I'm doing inventing, I'm doing interface design, I'm doing product design. I know roughly how many ideas I need to go through and explore to find one that's worth prototyping. And I know roughly what % of the prototypes that I make that people like that we can then bring to market. And it's like a lot, it's like dozens, right? When you multiply the two together. But like, I know, so like when I have a first idea, I'm like, okay, this is cool. There's only like a 5 to 10% shot we'll ever make anything out of this. Let me put the first 10, 20 hours in to see whether there's anything here. And I know if we go all the way to making a prototype, are people going to like it? It's about 1 in 6, right? And like, yeah, I know that. So I'm not like, all right, everybody, you know, right? As I'm the boss, I'm the CEO over at Ultra Working, right? If I said, everybody, okay, everyone, this is a huge winner. Let's all just like, you know, bust our ass and work really hard on this and do amazing on this. And then it like doesn't go, which most things don't, right? People are gonna be like, well, that sucks. I'm really let down. I'm like, hey, everyone, this is really super speculative. We're gonna like work hard. We're gonna see if people like this thing. Statistically speaking, they probably won't. You probably missed something. It's probably not that. It's probably not the thing, right? But we're gonna work hard. We're gonna get the feedback on it. We're gonna see if people like it, if there's something worth building on here. And you know, hey, we do this 20 times, we're gonna have 3 winners, right? So the ability to know. Other times I'm like dead sure something's gonna work. I'm like, this has all the characteristics of something that's gonna work. And I'm like, hey, everyone, this one's going to work. Please go all out on this, right? This one's going to work. Like, this has all the characteristics of working. We're like well over 90% of whatever this thing we're doing is going to work, right? So over time, learning this, and similar to how, you know, we lived in a world where you had to be in a condition of uncertainty for a few weeks before you could get a book from interlibrary loan, or, you know, pay $1 a minute on a long distance phone call, or whatever rates they were back in the day to talk to somebody many, many states away, to call them from Rhode Island to California, to talk to the person at UC Berkeley. It used to be very expensive, time consuming. And you had to wait longer to be able to get in touch with people and to get information. Now, not so much. Likewise, I think when people see techniques that they need to learn, this whole space can be learned in, I don't know, 3 to 20 hours of theoretical study will get you a large amount of the way there to have a solid theoretical grounding. And then like a set of making predictions and checking them. I don't know. I feel like if you do this like 10 times, you're really good. I don't know exactly how many you need to do it to cross over, but if you do this like 10 times, you'll be in really good shape, right? So there's some information there. What this actually looks like in practice, right? What this actually looks like in practice is, does everybody know this guy, Scott Alexander? Yeah, he was pseudonymous. He got kind of doxxed and had his identity revealed against his whatever, which made him stop writing for a little while, but then he started writing again. He's a California Bay Area psychiatrist who's very into like statistics and epistemology. He's very like autodidactic. He likes to learn a bunch of stuff and just seems like a swell guy. Just seems like a really nice guy. He's done this every single year where, and you don't have to do this. I'm really trying to expose you to a set of techniques that exist. Pick and choose the ones that are most interesting to you. Absolutely follow the ones that are of appeal to you. I happen to think this in particular is somewhat valuable, but it doesn't have to be this. There's dozens of techniques like this. If you develop any of these, which often getting a basic grounding in them is like, again, 3 to 10 hours, like not that much, right? You could do that in like one very excited Saturday, you know what I mean? Right. And especially if you have a friend that's into these sorts of things, a lot of us that like this sort of thing, like won't shut up about it if we know that you like it. So you could just like go over to their house, you know, get some cold brew coffee, get some nice food and just like riff and jam on, you know, some sort of statistics or controls or whatever. Right. And there's a bunch of adjacent stuff that can be really valuable, right? If you do something like this, and this is really easy, you write down, you could just do this naively, and then you could see how well calibrated you are, right? So interestingly, 2022 just ended, so we can check all these. He writes public predictions towards the start of the year of what do I think is going to be true at the end of the year. And then he could do one of these calibration graphs and does do them, right? It's like actually super simple. And people that like this sort of thing are very happy to help and engage and share with it if you're taking it seriously, like including me, right? So like you can absolutely follow up with me if this is the type of thing. I'm like not the best in the world at this. This is just something I like, but you know, it's not super complex, right? So, you know, he'll say, hey, I think Biden's approval rating, I'm 40% sure that it's going to be, you know, net positive, right? And, you know, like GameStop stock price is still above 100, right? Well, we can now do this and see whether he was right or not, right? So that's 1732 is the stock price, right? And he was only 30% sure it'd still be above 100, right? So he said, hey, 1 out of 3 things that I think are like this. Bitcoin still above 100K is 1 out of 5, right? So you can see he's right or wrong. And that's, I'm in Japan right now. That's 16,000, right? So you could see, right? A lot of people are like, oh, Bitcoin's going up, Bitcoin's going down. He's like, yeah, I think it's only 1 in 3 that GameStop is still above 100. He was right. I think it's only 20% that Bitcoin's still above 100K. That was 20%. Ethereum above 5K and so on. Bored ape floor price. It's like one of those, like if you see those weird Twitter images with like an ape smoking a cigarette or whatever, right? Is below the current price of 203. Okay. Right. It is 96, right? And the goal is not, so like, okay, so we just checked a couple of his, this one's right, this one's right, this one's right. He might be underconfident in his economic predictions. Do you know what I mean? Right? He wrote these all as positive predictions with like a below. He's actually like GameStop will be below 170% is what that actually, I mean, you could go either way, right? Inflation for the year. Google widely allows remote work, right? COVID cases worldwide, right? And like he makes like predictions about like his friends, like no one's going to move out. My friend is going to keep living in Indiana 90%, right? So I think that's neat and that grounds it in what's going on, right? He got married and he's like, hey, like 1 in 5 we have a baby this time next year, right? So presumably they weren't expecting as a couple when they came up with this in February. For him to have a child by the end of the year meant that he was implicitly predicting that they conceive within whatever 2 or 3 months or whatever from the prediction thing, right? You know, that's the firm that he works at. He opened his own clinic. We have 150 patients, 40%. But 200 patients, only 10%, right? So that's really interesting, right? That was like a relatively new firm when he created it. And I think like 30 or 40 of his past patients, something like that, joined up. So he said, hey, we're very likely to grow to 150. But he would have probably had to look at it, right? He would have had to look at it and say, hey, we would absolutely need to hire another psychiatrist to go substantially above 150. And I don't think I'm likely to do that, right? So you could see there's obvious applications in business here. You know, there's obvious applications in business here, but I also think there's applications to job searches, to making friends, to obvious implications to how you invest. But you could do this for all sorts of things, right? If you're big into political philosophy, you could say, hey, if so-and-so gets elected on a promise that they're going to reform the state legislature on such and such lines, what are the odds that it actually happens? What are the odds that a bill is introduced? What are the odds that a bill goes to committee? What are the odds that a bill passes? If you're into that sort of thing, there's like a process, right? On things that are like personal related, like we're gonna do a workout plan. Last time I encouraged people, hey, set some goals. and you can actually work with those after that, you could say, hey, what are the odds I actually stick with this goal? Or how many times do I think I'm going to go? If I think I'm going to go to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, if my resolution is to go to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu 3 times a week all year, how many times a year do I think, how many times do I think I'm actually going to go this year? Right? If you went every single week without a week off, that'd be, 52 weeks, 3 times, right? 156. How many times do I actually think I'm going to go? Well, I'll probably be sick. I'll probably be traveling. 130. Right? But then, if you wind up only going 18 times, well, now you've learned that sometimes you set one of those goals and then you either lose interest or get injured. And then maybe you're like, hey, I really wanted to stick with it, but I got injured. I should add injury prevention to what I'm doing next year. So you see, that's very practical. I think, and later we'll do this when we talk about more abstract philosophical stuff of how to bring this into very qualitative things to live nicely. But I think developing these sets of mental tools and skills makes you a much better thinker. It's very obvious in how it can do that in scientific and business contexts. I think those can be brought over to moral philosophy, political philosophy, happiness, and so on and so forth. So hopefully you got a few of the techniques today and an introduction to it. 2 things we could do right here at the end, right? General discussion, how do we make this work with large, complex, messy things in real life? I already talked about, sometimes you can measure a proxy variable, right? You might not be able to know, am I being sociable enough, right? Like if I want to be meeting people, but you can check like how many events did I show up to? How many times did I go to a programming event or a party or something? And you can use that as a proxy for sociability. It might be wrong. You might be on a lot of calls, or, you might just be more friendly at cafes, but you can sometimes put a proxy variable down. There's a lot like that. So if anybody has anything that they're working on that are, problems or things of interest that they're not sure how to measure and do math and science on, I'm happy to engage in that. I'm also happy to take general questions and just engage for the rest of the time for whatever's interesting to people. You can either unmute yourself and just jump in or put them into chat. We can explore kind of how to apply practically. And please don't be intimidated. I know sometimes this stuff is people are like, oh my goodness, I don't want to sound like a total dummy. And it's like, I think it's, no one's going to sound like a dummy. These are things that are unintuitive. These are things that are unintuitive. They don't come naturally to intuition. If you hear that there's like a 99% accurate test and somebody tested positive for something, you're like, okay, it's like 99%. Like, you don't know until you know the base rates. You need to learn that. Most doctors get that wrong, but like the medical faculty all agree that like they're getting it wrong, and like these are the actual numbers. It's a very rare thing. False positive is more likely, do you know what I mean, than the actual super rare thing, right?
Sebastian, I'm curious about you, because I know a little bit of your background. I don't think you went to got a PhD in science or anything like that, or any kind of scientific field, but you're pretty proficient at scientific literacy. And so a lot of people don't learn this stuff if they're not in that context, because it doesn't feel intuitive for them to learn it. And so I'm curious what forced you to learn it, or what inspired you to learn it. And maybe you can provide us some examples of how you applied it to practical real world situations.
Sure. So there's a few different ways to answer that. And actually, like the partial answer is what I'm trying to do for people here. And I actually am not 100% sure how to do it, but I think the hit rate will be okay, which is I'm trying to get people a taste of the raw joy and power that can be gotten out of it. Because once you get joy and power out of like, world is messy, right? But I was able to engage with it and like think about it in an intelligent way for not very long, and better things happened in my life. You get hooked and you want more of it. You know what I mean? Right? And I think that's how people get into, a lot of fields is, somebody picks up a guitar and they like doesn't sound good. And then like eventually they hit like a couple of chords in a row that they like, and they're like, that's cool. Wow, I'm doing something cool. This is so cool. Right? And then I really do think that's how people get involved in music is, they hear somebody, or they see somebody play that they like and respect. Maybe it's one of their parents, maybe it's a friend. And then they pick up a guitar. And it's like the first time you hit a couple of chords you like, you're like, wow, that's cool. And I'm doing something cool. Right. So how to get people to have that first experience with it. And then be like, yeah, okay, this isn't like super difficult stuff. To not answer your question, but to say, why don't people get into it, right? I think there's something that the second rate of experts do that's very bad for the world. And I'm not throwing shade at anybody. I think second rate experts that are not the real geniuses in their field like to make their field kind of sound complex and difficult to kind of bolster their own ego, right? Like people like Richard Feynman are like, hey, okay, there's like a complicated thing here, but like, don't worry, you can get through it. Like, we're going to work on this. Like, look, this is the weird part, but the rest of it's easy. And it's like, not magic. Look, we like saw like, why does this thing wobble? And we try to figure that out. And like, this is physics, right? And like, it's kind of weird. Like, why is it wobbling, you know, right? Whereas like second rate experts are like, oh, well, you know, with a gravity transformation, Doppler effect, oscillations, and you know, they try to like sound important, right? Really, really, really good lawyers will use like metaphors and analogies to try to make the law as simple as possible for people and try to put it in plain English. Almost really good lawyers who are good, but not the first rate of lawyers, will make the law sound very complex. Oh, well, you know, with the various indemnifications and guarantees and, you know, traditionally the case law and the enforcement. And, you know, first rate experts will make things accessible and second rate experts will make things intimidating and opaque. Maybe for ego bolstering, maybe they can't explain it or not a good communicator, maybe they don't understand it as deeply as someone like a Feynman, don't know. But people make things intimidating. So you think, hey, like medicine, like what can I learn about medicine? And it's like, you know, maybe I remember one of the milestone things, you asked how I got into it. One of the milestone things that I got into was understanding the pharmacokinetics of caffeine, right? So like caffeine, we all drink coffee, or a lot of us drink coffee, right? A lot of us drink coffee, we drink energy drinks, whatever, and people actually don't know what's going on in their body. Like you're taking this very powerful psychoactive substance that changes your mood, it changes how fast you think, like has these like these weird profiles. Like if you take it too late in the day, it's going to screw up your sleep, you know, like, you know, it changes over time as you use it. And people have never looked into this, like this very basic thing that you do all the time. Like, how does it work? Right. And I did. And I said, like, let me just try to figure this out using the magic of the internet. Like, how does caffeine work? And I read about it and I studied it and I looked into it. Eventually I went and I talked with people in biology and I made some friends in that space. But to start, I just looked into it on my own. Right. And I learned that caffeine is what's called an adenosine antagonist, right? Adenosine is a substance your body produces. It makes you sleepy. It builds up throughout the day, right? An antagonist in biology is something that like fights that thing off, right? So we could say that like armor is a sword antagonist. It like stops you from getting stabbed by the sword, right? If you're a knight wearing chainmail, right? So the way caffeine works, right? And then it gets complicated, right? Caffeine binds to your adenosine receptors without activating them. So adenosine binds to an adenosine receptor, you get sleepy, right? Caffeine binds to it and kind of blocks it. It's kind of like putting like a lid on top of the place that the sleepiness thing would go in, right? And I learned about that and like kind of the hormonal effects of it and whatever, and how it works. Then here's where it was magic. I learned that there's two different strategies for using caffeine. This is where it gets practical. You could do reinforcing caffeine usage, or you can do antagonistic caffeine usage, right? Antagonistic, people go through a natural sleep-wake cycle throughout the day. First off, you get tired later in the day, but also you go up and down a little bit throughout the day, right? You can either take caffeine when you're starting to get into a lull. That means that the caffeine will wear off when you were coming up out of it, right? That will flatten you out. That's really good if you're like doing like truck driving or something where there's no like top level performance needed, but you want to be stable and good. But a lot of great thinkers would time their caffeine to take caffeine when they're just coming off of the bottom, take caffeine and have a nap to have more higher peaks and like lower valleys, right? So a lot of people have caffeine when they're sleepy, and that actually flattens out their performance, right? Sometimes you go down. You can let yourself go down, get tired, nap when you're in the lull, the early afternoon lull, not have caffeine there when you're getting sleepy, write off an hour or two, time the caffeine along with a nap. So when you come out of it, you have more peak stuff. And it depends. Are you doing work that's more like theoretical physics, inventing type stuff? Are you trying to make some really cool art? Or do you need like slow and steady, highly accurate performance with no errors, but there's no outperformance? So when you get into something like that and you understand how this stuff works, and that was like the 2-minute off the cuff treatment of it. And then you're like, okay, cool. Like I can design when I take caffeine for myself. And I can like, do I need to be like steady all day, or do I want to be really sharp during my peak times and time it for that? And it actually works. And if you're trying to do like novel theoretical work, if you actually set up your caffeine usage to do that, you will have better ideas and you will produce more. I've tracked this and measured this. That's another story, right? But like, yes, you can generate more ideas if you use caffeine more smartly. Or the alternative, there's times that I was on like long drives and I had to do night driving. And like for those, you don't want to be more alert when you're alert and like not alert when you're not alert. You want to do antagonistic caffeine usage so you don't crash the car. It's all about being reasonably alert. I don't know. I feel like once people get like 2 or 3 of these, you know, you could get there through weightlifting, you get there through statistics. I paid some of my bills in college during the American poker boom. You know, when it was like a craze. I don't know if people remember party poker and all that. Yeah, I paid some of my bills through that. So that's very much like amenable to mathematics and very much like not amenable to like, let's just go for it. You know what I mean? Like it's like, hey, let's settle down. It's all math, right? I feel like once you nail 1 or 2 or 3 things like that using these techniques, it gets like addictive. It's like, wow, we can really understand and make sense of the world and like live better and think clearer and get more results by like looking into stuff. Last thing I would say to your point of you don't have a PhD and such, to generalize, okay, there's like some scientists that are like pretentious and whatever. Most of them aren't. Most of them are like the nicest people in the world. And if you've done a little bit of getting oriented in the space and you're a little bit humble and you're a little bit of a good communicator, they'll just talk with you forever about science. And they love people that are scientifically literate and curious. I was on a train with a friend of mine that is an entrepreneur, but he was trained as an engineer. We're looking out the window of the train. And I said to him, I said, Miguel, man, I got a question for you. It's kind of weird. How come I can see through the glass? Like, you know, like you can't see through most stuff. Like I can't see through a tree. Right? I can't see through a tree, right? I can't see through a wall, right? I can't see through the dirt, but like that's glass. It's like a physical thing, but I can see through it. That's like freaking bizarre, man. Like, how come I can see through it? And he was like, well, okay, let me talk about like light refraction. I didn't follow it, to be clear, it didn't stick, but he tried. He tried his best to explain. And yeah, I feel like a lot of times people are worried about like looking dumb. All of us will meet people at some point that are a doctor, that are an engineer, that are a scientist sooner or later. And yeah, if you're already kind of curious and interested in the space and you can ask good questions and be kind of humble about it, people will like teach you and share with you and so on. When COVID went off, I called everybody I knew that was into virology and we just like worked on models of it together. I went like read a few papers and I started like calling and saying like, hey, could there be variants? When there was like a dozen, like somewhere between 1 and 2 dozen cases in the US, I was calling people that were like retired in virology and asking like, hey, what if this mutates? Like, what's the worst case scenario there? We actually wrote some white papers about it and like kind of shipped them around. Nobody listened to us, but you know, a few people did actually made a little bit of a difference. But and yeah, I have no background in it, but I don't know, nobody was doing it. Greg put something in a chat. I'm doing a project that uses this sort of thing in the industrial sphere, which is why I joined. I have a simple theory. I have some proxy variables. I'm halfway through building some software to make it possible to test my theory. I'm taking a guess at what data I will collect, but have an experimental design, a bit like changing apartment idea, but I can only test across time as opposed to control. I read things like, yep, there's like randomness and random walks and stuff. Yep, but I invented the design. Yeah. Greg, that's like a super abstract question. I think there's probably like I could probably be more useful if you give me more context. I could probably be more useful if you give me more context. Nerd sniping come in, yeah. Also, did I answer your question, Peter? Did I get at what you were asking?
Yeah, I like the coffee story. That was your entry point. I'm wondering how that could be framed for people. It's almost like the applied science. It seems like maybe a better term than industrial philosophy for this kind of like through line of a lot of stuff that you're presenting here. And then what can you apply this scientific mindset toward something that's relevant and salient in your life?
Yeah, I just think the ability to like think clearly is like really, really valuable. I mean, that sounds obvious, but like, you know, it's like if you tell somebody like you're not thinking clearly, right? Like it will either come across as like an insult, right? Or it'll come across in like a I'm better than you sort of way, typically. Right. But a lot of times people aren't thinking clearly. Do you know what I mean? Right. It's kind of like if somebody's like, you know, whatever, like, hey, I'm like eating too many donuts. And they're like, and I'm just never going to do that again. And it's like, why is it happening? I don't know, but I'm never doing it again. It's like, I don't know. It's just like, just relax. Like, when and where and why do you eat donuts? Right? Like, are you not having enough calories? Are you in a hurry? Is it when you're stressed? Like, let's get a little bit of causality, right? What's your environment like? Where, like literally where and when do you either purchase or procure the donuts that you consume? Do you know what I mean? Do you tend to binge on donuts periodically, or do you tend to graze on donuts? And like, there's like, you know, just like get the facts and then like try to figure it out. Because there's a huge difference if you're very busy and you're like very undercaloried and you eat whatever's around and there's donuts in your office versus if you like stress eat. There's like different solutions to these problems. They're both eating too many donuts problem, but they're like completely different solutions, right? If you eat because you're stressed, right? And donuts have sugar and salt and fat and calories and such, right? They taste nice, maybe, right? If you're eating because you're stressed, right? Or if you're eating because you're legitimately like skipping breakfast, you're in like a super hurry, you're in meetings immediately, you're on the go, you don't have a whatever setup. One of them is like, okay, how do we have a plethora of healthy food around that's acceptable and fast? Tons of almonds and snacks and whatever, or a baseline of meals, or I mean, there's different ways you could design around it, right? So that's one way. That's one way to solve that problem if you're just eating because it's convenient, there's donuts in the office. Or, you know, if you live at, you know, if you work at like a cool hip company that like has some food around and stuff, just like lobby them to get some healthier food a little bit, like ask nicely. They'll probably go for it. Hard-boiled eggs, whatever, right? The flip side, if it's stress eating, then you want to go a little bit deeper and say, okay, is it the sweetness that's helping you, or is it the calories, or is it that you're doing something? If it's sweetness, I know some bodybuilders that are pretty serious bodybuilders, and they tend to be into science. Bodybuilders are power lifters. Some of them absolutely have sweet tooths and they crave it, but they go through these bulking cutting cycles and they're trying to be either shredded if it's aesthetic bodybuilding, or they're trying to have extremely good power mass ratios. You know, like sugar's inflammatory, it's not good for you, like whatever, right? We all know that. They go very, very heavy on like artificial sweetener drinks. Now, jury's still out as to which of the artificial sweeteners are safe and stuff, but almost all of the very, very serious bodybuilders I know that go through hard cutting cycles while carrying a lot of muscle mass. So you're like very hungry and agitated when you're very, very big, strong individual that's been on a super caloric surplus and now you're on a cutting cycle. Like your body just does not like it. And it tends to, I've done it. It's like not pleasant, right? They tend to buy a lot of sugarless Gatorade, the powders that you mix in, Coke Zero and stuff like that. And they go through a ton of it. So their fridge, actually, if you don't look at it and realize it's all sugar-free stuff, looks like a bunch of junk and crap in the fridge, right? But they get into that. Some of them also use cinnamon, which like tastes sweet, but is a spice. It's not sugar. It's not perfect, but it's okay. You can like aggressively cinnamon protein powder. I knew one guy who was a very, very strong lifter, and he would whip protein powder with an egg aggressively and then put it in the microwave, and it would bake into something cake-like, and then he would cinnamon the heck out of it. And it really, really, really tasted and had a composition a lot like cake. He like wanted and like really badly wanted stuff like that in his diet, and that kept him from eating, you know, donuts and whatever, right? So, you know, being able to do the cause and effect and then to test an intervention. Would a sugarless drink, Coke Zero, would a protein mud cake, protein powder, egg, cinnamon, would those hit that note that I need? That's why I'm having the donut. And then you like test it and you see if it works, and you just like stay with it if it's an important enough problem to you until you get it. Greg said, how do you make this work scale? You have 7 or so people interested enough for 1.5 hours. How do you change this into 1 billion? So you want to get 1 billion people into scientific literacy. Okay. I've thought about this actually. What I try to do at Ultra Working is, thank you for setting me up for the sales pitch. It's not why I wanted to do it. You know, wasn't setting it up on purpose. I'm just here for the love of it and grateful to be here. But, you know, one of our theories, one of our premises at Ultra Working is that some percentage of people will be interested in theory and learning the basis of all of it, and most people won't. And most people won't. For those people, how do you give them tools that will get the best practices to happen correctly without knowing the underlying theory? How can you design things well enough, right? Some people will study how should your posture be, right? Like how should your posture be when you're sitting to be perfectly healthy when you're sitting? And they'll go through anatomy and posture and come up with a theory. But most people will just sit however the chair and desk makes it convenient to sit. So you design the chairs and the desks as well as you can, and then you got the 80-20 for people. They could do better, right? You can invite them to do better. You can say, and by the way, there's all this theory of ergonomics and anatomy and blah, blah, blah. Most people won't engage with it. That's okay. Can't engage with everything. The world's huge, right? You can't be, get into everything, right? So that's kind of it. So I think, getting people to run best practices, and ideally also like that can show people that it's not too difficult. Do you know what I mean? And like make it accessible so that when they come on their own time, but in every space there's ratios of how many people produce, consume, and participate, and there's various internet configurations. Of a registered users on a website, something like 1% of people will make the majority of the content, and still a small percentage of people, single digits, will comment on it and engage, and then a much larger percent of people will take things in passively. And I'm not throwing shade. Sometimes it's said as like an elitist statement, but when you think about it, like, right, I consume Hollywood movies, and I'm not a film critic. I've never written a film critique, and I don't make movies. So like actually in the majority of domains in the world, you're going to be just a consumer and observer, not a participant and a creator. And that's like totally fine. That's totally fine. I do think making things overly complicated and like Peter said, right? Like, hey, Sebastian, you don't have a PhD. How'd you get into this stuff? And it's like, yeah, you ideally would learn this stuff in a PhD program, and the good ones would go through it. But it's like on the internet, you just get interested in it and spend some time with it. You don't need, I don't know if people have ever like engaged. Maybe some people here have doctoral degrees, right? Or know somebody that does. There's like a lot of like hanging out and talking like is a big part of it. Like we're all capable of like hanging out and talking about important ideas and then working on them and getting more rigorous about them if need be and if relevant, right? So yeah, to your point, Greg, like how to make it scale. I think my friend Nick Winter, he runs a company called Code Combat, where they teach kids how to program by like playing multiplayer video games, but you have to use programming to control your units. Right. So take something kids want to do, have like my orcs kill their orcs, or my spaceships shoot out their spaceships, or whatever. Right. Kids like the form factor of games. It's fun. And then instead of using, your mouse and your keyboard, you just like have to write programming commands to tell your units what to do. It's like small leap, but then like it's not like, oh my gosh, coding. Right. The other thing that I would say that I think is really valuable is, I think, for people, so I'm by necessity bringing it in the abstract. We talked about this during session 0, where it was like, hey, pick a personal project you're going to work on, do some measurements or goals, and then you can actually apply this, right? It was something I said last time, so that anybody that wanted to could engage. And I said, here's my email, you can email me, and so on and so forth. Sebastian@ultraworking.com once again. But sometimes there's like a joke in my social circle that people want to learn to code, capital L, capital T, capital C. So whenever we write capital L, capital T, capital C, learn to code, like that's not great, right? Sometimes an exclamation point, right? When someone wants to learn to code, like the hit rate on that is pretty low, because they just like heard programming is important, right? Whereas most of the people I know that learn to code, right, like had something they wanted to do where they needed to do some programming around it, right? I actually just had help from AI for the first time in product design for the first time. We put out a new, very small product around New Year's. And one thing I wanted was a call sign generator. So we have a leaderboard on it, and I didn't want to deal with usernames because, like, people can register an abusive username. It's like a nasty thing. And like, there's all kinds of like filters and stuff that you don't realize going on behind the scenes that like Twitter, like official Red Cross can't be like registered by you as like a scam and then send me your money or whatever, right? So like we didn't want to deal with usernames, right? We didn't want to put people's personal names on there or their emails, right? For privacy reasons. So we built a call signs generator, right? Where we take one adjective, glorious, analytical, steadfast, sure-footed, whatever, and one noun, engineer, firefighter, cook, hippopotamus, like whatever. And the call signs generator would put together a random like list of call signs. User could take one of three, or they could hit refresh. So it could be like glorious engineer, analytical dolphin, happy chef, and you could just refresh until you found a call sign that you liked. And I used ChatGPT from OpenAI to help me go through a list of over 1,000 adjectives and over 1,000 nouns and narrow them down to ones that wouldn't sound weird using different criteria and groupings. And then I also had it help me write, just for testing purposes, the randomizer, the spreadsheet randomizer, take this from here and that from there and like refresh it in Excel for me when I was testing it. And like, that was cool. Right. So like I'm learning how to use the thing, but I'm not like learning in a super abstract. I think that's valuable to go play with things, but like I had something I wanted to do. And like that's how you learn things. So I think when somebody has something that is a problem that can be solved using this sort of thing, because things like, getting more fit or earning more or investing better, or meeting people that you want to associate with are amenable to this sort of thinking. I think building strong teams, product development, like, I don't know, it's like making music that other people like and will listen to. Like you can use these sorts of things on a problem that's in your own life that's very concrete. It takes a while. It's not instant gratification, right? But if you get into it and then you start to get some results, that's pretty cool. And then you can both expand the places that you use the tools, and you can also start applying the type of thinking to more abstract and qualitative problems that are not amenable to doing brute force statistics on, but you can think about them rigorously and kind of bring that type of problem solving too. If that answers the question. Cool. Yeah, it's a pleasure across the board. What do we have coming up next time? We'll give a little preview. We'll give you a little preview.
Well, Sebastian,
Yo.
It's hard to get in a word. You're feeling it's marvelous. Last time I said I feel you have a skill for ongoing, on ramping. I do feel that, like on ramping into the science. I'm also seeing you travel really easily between the science and the practical. I can see that.
Thank you.
That I think is really that's your strength that you have, that you can spread, I think, because you're right, not everybody's going to go for the science. And not for answering now, but what I want to play with, because I'm still digesting all this, but I don't know if you know the work of Gene Genland from years ago. This is in felt sense. Okay. It's not about embodiment or anything like that. It's very interesting, the data that can happen from felt sense. And it's a kind of cognition. It's not about insight. It's none of that. He was a true scientist and philosopher. So I'm just throwing that out as, because who knows where those predictions that I come up with come from. Are they coming from my felt sense? Where am I deciding to believe in something? So I'd love to play with that a little bit with you. And also, I think you put your email in, but you said it so quickly I didn't hear it. And you do talk quickly, that.
From Boston. From Boston. So
thank you, Sebastian.
Yeah, so email is in chat. I will look up felt sense. I'm also actually interested in that topic, and I don't know because I haven't looked into to this particular. I just typed it in and Google got me the correct person. Genelin, right?
Yeah, focusing is And that was not his word, okay? Focusing is something that one of his disciples took on. So really his work, would be the one you'd want to look at.
I will. Thank you. And I love, and by the way, so, Peter, you asked me a while ago, like, how do you get into all this sort of thing? Well, once you're a little bit in, it's kind of like, it's kind of like you go around, you trade Pokemon cards with people, except you get to keep your original Pokemon card. You don't lose it when you trade it, so, Danny here is like, hey, Sebastian, do you have a Charizard? Here you go. And I'm like, oh, okay, here's a Lapras. So you can kind of trade scientific concepts with people, and you're both the better off for it. I can share one back with you, Danny. It might or might not be relevant. It sounds like it is, but without having looked into Jelen, I don't know. Damasio's somatic markers hypothesis, I took pretty seriously. Yeah. Okay. And for anybody else. Yeah. So for anybody else, that's a very interesting one. And I came across that through Max Tegmark, the MIT physicist. He was taking that very seriously. So one of the things, it's interesting, a lot of the most interesting stuff cognitively and affectively. Affective is a funny, cognitive is a fancy word for thinking, and affective is a fancy word for emotion, right? A lot of the most important stuff on there is like very difficult to evaluate whether it's good or rigorous or not on a quick look. And there's like a lot of junk in the world where people will like say some stuff that's junk, and then there's some like cutting edge, precious stuff. So one of my cues is I find somebody that I find credible, that's a good thinker, that I respect their general thinking. And then if they say, hey, this around perception or how you feel in your body or how emotions arise or self-regulation or whatever, this other thinker is good, then I'll come in, predisposed to take it seriously, even if it seems a little odd at first. Yeah, Damasio's somatic markers is I got that via Tegmark, and that's really, it's really, really interesting stuff of like, how do you, I'm not even gonna do it justice in a minute or two. It's really interesting. So I'll check out Jenilyn, and thank you for that.
All right, Danny, thank you. Sebastian, anything you want to mention for next week coming up?
Yeah, we're pretty good to go. Next week, we're gonna do like practical analysis and synthesis, which is like how to take problems apart to their constituent pieces and put them together in better ways. So Peter, we gotta market the heck out of this. I don't know, maybe industrial philosophy sounds like it's too industrial or too, probably not too philosophical. Yeah. We've identified, we've made that hypothesis ourselves. But next week's gonna be a great one. So by all means, tell everybody and bring people. I feel like a lot of times when people have a complex problem, right, they try to solve it in like one big go, right, as opposed to taking it apart to its constituent pieces, which is what analysis is. It's a fancy word, but like being able to deliberately do analysis and then synthesis to put things together so it goes well. And this can be done from anything of like, hey, how do I improve my health or my energy levels, to like, how do I throw a really cool party that people really like attending, right? And you could do analysis like, hey, what's needed for a party, like guests that like each other, blah, 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 you know what I mean? And like getting them together. And that means there's invites and, right? So you can derive. So that kind of is the bridge to more practicality. And then we can, in future weeks after that, zoom out. But next week's hyper practical, how to analyze things in a very practical way to get results, and then how to put them together in a really nice configurations in one's life. So hyper practical one next week. We'll be delighted to see you there. Please spread the word that this is not, we're not running maybe we are running a research lab. I don't know. I don't think we're running a research lab. I think it's really practical stuff. So spread the word, tell everybody at the STOA, and I'll spread the word. But I'm happy this was a relatively intimate one, and I'm looking forward to next week.
Very cool. And yeah, this the misleading title, like there has to be, this is like filling a gap. This what Danny was suggesting, the theoretical translating to the practical, which you're amazing at. I don't know what construct that really just lands it out there, like maybe bespoke applied science. We have to like create something like that, BAS. So we'll think about maybe renaming the title of the series. But yeah, this is really exciting, and hope to see everyone next week. And elsewhere at the STOA, Malcolm Ocean is returning. He does something called the Goal Crafting Intensive every year. And so he's having a goal crafting foundations, dreaming big at the Stoa. That's on January 9th at 5 p.m. Eastern time. You can RSVP to that at the stoa.ca, and you can check out more sessions on their website. So that being said, Sebastian, everyone, thank you so much for coming to Stoa today.
Thanks for attending. A pleasure. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Happy New Year.